So we are all here today because we know that sea level rise is happening. And adapting to sea level rise will require big changes along our shoreline. And we want to make sure that how we adapt and collectively think about these changes, that the shoreline, that we don't leave a large concrete wall around the edge of the bay for our children's generation to deal with. And so how we make these changes will really determine the fate and the health of the bay. We believe that a science-based framework is essential to identify effective adaptation strategies that are appropriate for their particular setting and that take advantage of natural processes. So we've created this report, the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas, to start filling the gap in thinking through these questions of where can we put nature-based strategies in San Francisco Bay? Where are they appropriate based on the physical setting? And how do we do that in terms of the scale that we're looking at? How do we get together and plan for this impending disaster that's waiting to happen that we keep looking at maps about? So we have had the pleasure of working in San Mateo County, and the big challenge here is transitioning from this awesome vulnerability assessment that Marcus talked about into actual solutions of what we're going to do about that vulnerability. So there's been lots of interest in nature-based options, and the goal here was to develop a framework, process, and set of tools to support the transition from vulnerability assessment to adaptation strategies at a very useful scale. So we also know that sea level rise will not stop at our city boundaries. We see this during king tide events and during large storm events, and sometimes a combination of the two. And when we look at a map of our traditional jurisdictions, we see that this situation is much more complicated. In the Bay Area, we have 9 counties, 101 cities, multiple special districts, regulatory jurisdictions, and frontline communities in low-lying areas. And these communities will be the hardest hit by the climate crisis, and these communities are some of the most disadvantaged and historically disadvantaged communities in the Bay. And so it's very important that we bring these communities along in this process. So we started with the recognition that the Bay and shoreline are diverse and dynamic. So there's no one-size-fits-all easy approach to sea level rise adaptation. And we also recognize that natural infrastructure, such as beaches and wetlands, in conjunction with traditional infrastructure like levees and shoreline protection structures, can help us lessen flood risk. The added benefit of natural infrastructure is that we get a number of other benefits like habitat, recreation, carbon sequestration, and aesthetics. So we started this adaptation atlas to address sea level rise by first dividing up the bay into manageable units that respond to physical and ecological processes that are happening. Then we mapped suitability of nature-based adaptation measures. And finally, we're starting to figure out how to evaluate the trade-offs between the choices that we might make. We broke down our framework into 3 major steps. The first step is planning using nature's boundaries instead of those traditional ones that I showed you. The second step is all about identifying these adaptation measures that could work well in a given place and use nature as much as we can. The third step is to use the OLU framework when bringing stakeholders together to envision a resilient future. So OLUs, these are operational landscape units, kind of a heavy term to throw around. We're in shorthand calling these nature's boundaries. And so the definition that we've given this is areas with shared geophysical and land use characteristics suited for a particular suite of nature-based measures. And the important thing here is that we think these OLUs are a useful scale to think about sea level rise planning because they're bigger than a project, bigger than a city, smaller than a county, and never split watersheds. And we've created 30 OLUs for the entire Bay Area. And for San Mateo County specifically, we delineated 5 OLUs. And you can see here that they do extend over county boundaries, so we're showing that nature doesn't follow our traditional jurisdictions. How we actually delineated these units, that's a very lengthy thing to get into, and I don't have time for that. I think Chesney would agree. And we have an over 200-page report that goes into all the great details of how we did this, so feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in, and it's free online to download as a PDF. So for the second step, identify adaptation measures that could work well in a given place, we came up with a list of nature-based features as well as regulatory, financial, and policy tools that we could potentially use. Now, this is not a complete list. This is a first cut, and we very much look forward to growing this list over time. For each adaptation measure on the nature-based side, we talk about in our report landscape configuration and process guidelines, ecosystem functions that can come out of each measure, coastal risks managed like short-term sea level rise, long-term sea level rise, storm surge, etc. We also talk about ecosystem services that you get from each, and we go into some policy considerations. This is a big obstacle for a lot of agencies and a lot of people trying to do this work. So we talk about what are the permits that you might be up against and how to think through those. And wherever we can, we highlight case study examples of where these already exist in the ground, either in the Bay Area, in the country, or internationally. So for the nature-based measures, we looked at subtidal measures like nearshore reefs and eelgrass, and then we also looked more in the upper watershed like creek to bayland reconnections and green stormwater infrastructure and mapped those for the whole bay. And then we rated them based on suitability. And the takeaway here is that not everything is appropriate everywhere and shouldn't go everywhere. But also we have to think about what we need to do in those dry areas where we work and live. What is the menu of available structural, policy, financial, and regulatory measures? So Spur, our partner on this project, did a really in-depth analysis looking at place types. So they took a number of land use layers and combined them to characterize the entire Bay Area in terms of our OLU study area. And this is important because it helps us understand, the policy and financial and regulatory tools that work in downtown San Francisco in the financial district are going to be very different than the Napa-Sonoma Baylands. So we looked at things like zoning and overlay zones all the way to buyouts. And what this all boils down to are these suitability maps where we show in a spatially explicit way this menu of options. Now I want to stress it's a menu, it's a toolkit. It is not an adaptation plan. It's something that people can use and stakeholders can use to get together, look at some of the feasible things that you can do based on the physical processes, and then determine what makes sense based on your values and your issues and your vulnerability. So in Belmont Redwood, for example, you could do beaches, marsh restoration, and horizontal levees because there's a bit more space in some areas along the shoreline. And then for the dry side, we could look at zoning changes, elevating the roadways or floodable spaces. And these are just potential options. And finally, we'll use the framework to bring stakeholders together to envision a resilient future. This can be used as a resource to assist environmental review and permitting, for guidance for developers and project applicants, and also for local and regional planners, as well as communities to create adaptation plans and policies. In the fall of 2018, we worked in San Mateo County to look at land uses, the vulnerability assessment outcomes, as well as the nature-based measures, and try to pilot this approach. So these are some specific opportunities in a very preliminary way that we paired for each of the 5 OLUs in San Mateo County. And from there, we came up with these initial outcomes from these 2 workshops. First, we created scenarios in each OLU. We evaluated the trade-offs with NatCat to decide between decisions and understand what different ecosystem services you get in each scenario. And then this will culminate in these OLU-specific info sheets with vulnerabilities and opportunities that's coming soon, and will hopefully help in making decisions and walking through this process. So thank you so much. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me during the day. You can also go to adaptationatlas.sfei.org to access the PDF, and we also have some printed copies.